Welcome back to another edition of the Prepper Recon Podcast. Our mission is to bring you great interviews with preppers from around the world so you can be better informed and better prepared for everything from a hurricane to the end of the world as we know it. Whether your plan is to bug out or bug in, CampingSurvival.com has all of your preparedness needs, including fish antibiotics, long-term storage food, water filters, bug-out bags, and first aid kits. Use coupon code Prepper Recon for 5% off your entire order at CampingSurvival.com. I put together a compact individual first aid kit, or IFAK, that's perfect for gunshot wounds, car accidents, and other traumatic injuries. It's a MOLLE-compatible pouch in Coyote, ACU, or black. It's equipped with an Israeli battle dressing, quick clot, an Asherman chest seal, nasopharyngeal airway, a TK4 tourniquet, 3 pre-threaded nylon sutures, EMT shears, betadine swabs, steri strips, and lots of extras. It's perfect for your glove box, bug-out bag, or home first aid kit. Go to the PrepperRecon.com homepage and click on the IFAK store tab at the top of the page. $99 includes shipping, and this kit could save your life. Today's guest is Washington State Representative Matt Shea. Representative Shea, thanks for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Mark.
Oh, absolutely. Now, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a Army combat veteran. I was in the United States Army for 10 years. I ended as a company commander in the infantry in Iraq, and I also served as a platoon leader in the cavalry in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I'm now the 4th District State Representative for Spokane Valley, Washington, which is tucked up right on the Idaho border and as far away from Olympia as we can get. I'm also a constitutional attorney and practicing here in Spokane, and really love what you're doing, really love the whole idea of being a God-fearing, self-reliant, freedom-loving American. So thank you for everything you're doing with your show and your podcast.
And thank you for your political service and for your military service. That's very important. And thanks for assuming that leadership role for the Patriot movement, because I think that's so important. You know, we can bash government and everything, but at the end of the day, I don't think any of us wants anarchy, and the only way we can move forward and reclaim our freedom is to have good, godly, constitutional leadership like you and what you're doing, and so that's so important. I'm very grateful for that.
Well, I always try to keep in mind, in politics that our hope is not in man, our hope is in Jesus Christ, and that has to be at the forefront. But at the same time, in the Patriot movement, in the freedom movement, I really sum up everything by saying that leadership is not the ability to compromise, it's the ability not to. It's the ability to articulate our principles in such a way to bring people over to our point of view. And that, I think, really encompasses it. We don't hate government or not want any government. What we want is constitutional government.
Absolutely. Now, you just got back from Bunkerville?
Indeed, Bunker Hill, as it were. And right near April 19th, Patriots Day, which incidentally is the day after my birthday. So everything is kind of converging. Yeah, I was down there for a couple of days, and we had an advance team from Washington State down there for about 5 days. And was there actually on Saturday when everything happened. It was a tremendous encouragement to me to see so many Patriots out there. And when we put out the phone call last week and put out the email last week calling on all state legislators, calling on sheriffs and veterans to come down there, boy, the American people answered. It was just incredible.
And what was the situation like when you left?
Well, when we left, it was calm, but there were reports inside, I'm not going to say exactly where, but inside some government agencies that this was not over, and they were going to wait until there was kind of a calming down and then come back. So we have set up a vigil with the Bundys at the ranch, state legislators and sheriffs and just great American patriots that are going to be standing vigil with them for as long as necessary to make sure that they remain free.
Yeah, after the standoff ended, Nevada Senator Harry Reid said, we can't have an American people that violate the law and then just walk away from it. And I say amen to that. So does that mean he's going to press for charges against James Clapper for lying under oath, or is he planning to arrest Eric Holder for the Fast and Furious escapade, or is Lois Lerner, is she going to be going to prison? I think there's probably some folks at Goldman Sachs that were taking both sides of the trade on the housing bubble with the subprime collateralized debt obligations, selling them as AAA rated securities, and then taking short positions against them when they knew that they were garbage. I would say that would probably constitute as fraud and insider trading both. So I'm sure there's some folks there that need to go to jail. Is that what he's talking about?
Yeah, well, clearly not. I mean, he's clearly involved in this and using environmental law as a weapon so that he can enrich his crony friends. You know, that aside, if you really believe that as Americans we all need to obey the law, then that has to include government. And that's just not happening right now. Let me give you a couple examples of just from on the ground down there. So there's a court order to seize the cattle. But the federal government comes in there and they don't seize the cattle. They also kill them. In fact, I have a picture on my Facebook page from one of the bulls that was shot at a very high angle, which means that it was likely shot from a helicopter that was killed on the Bundy Ranch. So you have to ask yourself, is this really about the Bundys breaking the law, or is this more about just the government intimidating people into silence over the issue of land and property rights in the West? And I think it's that reason that this whole thing happened. The other example that I would give you is that a sniper rifle is not due process. So pointing sniper rifles at women and children on the ground, which happened over there, is not due process and is not going to solve anything. And very candidly, they lost the PR war when that happened. And I think we have to keep that in mind as patriots, that we're not supposed to be aggressors. We're supposed to be Americans that believe that the role of government is to protect our God-given unalienable rights to life, liberty, property, and the ability to defend the same. And when the federal government comes in and does something like that, we have to stand together against them. And that was the huge lesson out of this whole thing, that when we stand together, united on principle, we don't give up, we don't back down, we win.
And like you said, they were allowed to seize the cattle according to the court order, but not destroy them. That'd be similar to if you parked in a handicap zone and they didn't just tow your car, but they blew it up.
Exactly. And on top of that, they would owe you the loss of use of that car. In this particular case, the cattle, a bull particularly, is worth a lot of money, and all the generations that bull would have fostered, the federal government owes the Bundys that right now.
Now, since the BLM did back off and they've pulled out for now, can we say that the good guys won in Nevada, or do we need to see some criminal charges against the BLM?
Well, I think this was a win, but I think that I don't think it's necessarily even criminal charges at this point. I think that's important. I think the bigger overarching issue is disarming these lifer bureaucrats in the federal government that have no business carrying guns. I mean, for goodness sakes, the BLM, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has armed agents. We have got to disarm the federal lifer bureaucrats if we want to see any change in what's going on. And the second thing I think that needs to happen that's almost equally important, we need to get this land transferred back to the states for management as was originally intended by the Enabling Acts for virtually all the western states.
Now, you're a constitutional attorney, you said. Doesn't the Constitution protect the federal government's right to own most of the property in several different states?
Well, so let me give you an example. So Washington State came into the Union along with Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota. Currently, North Dakota and South Dakota have an average of about 5% of their land owned by the feds. In Washington State, it's about 41%. In Nevada, depending on who you talk to, it's 76 to 84% is owned by the federal government. But in that enabling act that brought us into the Union, it actually says that the federal government is supposed to be a steward of that land until such time as the states request that land back. So the Enabling Act, the very thing that brought us into the Union, actually has the mechanism, the constitutional mechanism, to make sure that that land gets transferred back to the states. North and South Dakota have already done it. We're working on it here in Washington, along with Ken Ivory in Utah, to make this for all of the western states, that we demand that that control of the land goes back to the states where it was originally intended. Now, I want to caveat that by saying this. It doesn't necessarily mean that the state's a better manager of the land, although in Washington state a study was done that showed that state-managed land was managed 1,800% better than federal land. I think the best manager of the land is the people. So we get that land back to the states, state control as a first step, then we sell some of that land back to private citizens and put it back into productive use. That ultimately is how this should happen, because government closest to the people is best, and the most efficient use of that land is actually going to come from the people themselves.
And now, I'm not a biologist, but I did have to take biology to get my accounting degree. I don't know why. But I remember in there that you sort of have these little ecosystems. Anytime you have land or an area, you've got different types of animals that are doing things and creating an ecosystem. I would think having a cow out in a desert area like that would be fertilizing the ground so that plants could grow, so that this little desert tortoise that this whole thing was supposedly over would have something to eat. Isn't that how things usually work?
Well, usually, and I mean, it's been working for 120 years. You know, I mean, the cows just, yeah, exactly. What broke was the federal government thinking it could manage land better than the people. And I'll talk a little bit about that, but the bottom line is that, yeah, it's good for the environment, actually, for these cattle to be out there. And you can ask any farmer at the end of cutting season, when they bring cattle on to eat up the stubble and then fertilize the field, that's exactly why they do it. So farmers throughout the West use that. This is no different. And, you know, you've got some radical environmentalists driving this train. In fact, I got a phone call the other day from some professor / journalist out of Oregon who writes for the Tortoise. There's actually a paper called The Tortoise for the Turtle Conservancy Group, and they wanted to interview me, and my response simply was that human life is more important than a tortoise, and this has been working for 120 years. You know, what went wrong?
Wow. Now, what was your assessment of the response from Oath Keepers? Was it well organized, and was there a big turnout?
It was a huge turnout by Oath Keepers. There were sheriffs down there. We have since we came together and had a meeting and decided that we should all coordinate throughout all the western states, and we have formed now the Coalition of Western States that includes leadership from Oath Keepers, leadership from constitutional sheriffs and elected officials and other patriots throughout the West, because we want to have a coordinated response next time that this happens. This will happen again, whether it's the Bundy Ranch or another place. This will happen again, and we have to be ready for it. So that, I think, was a huge positive, and especially Stuart Rhodes with the Oath Keepers. He and I go back a ways, and he's just done an excellent job, and they did show up down there, and they were very level-headed. These are just patriotic Americans that have said enough is enough, and it was just a really good time of fellowship, and a time to get to know each other and really see the Americans that are willing to walk the walk.
And what about the militia? Was there a big militia turnout, and were they well organized and well behaved as well?
Well, there were some militia there, and there were a couple that were, I think, causing some problems down there. But for the most part, the people that I talked to were very well organized, very, very disciplined, and understood the reason they were there was to protect, you know, our freedoms and liberties, not just for us, but for our children and our grandchildren. So, yeah, I thought it went very, very well, and was very well attended. I know militia to a lot of people is a dirty word. However, it is in the Constitution of the United States, and most states have it in there as well. So, really, I think what it is just Americans who are exercising the right to self-defense and will stand up against tyranny, and do that. And we have to do that as Americans. That's what the founding fathers did. They stood up against tyranny. So, you know, I thought it went very, very well. And I would like to add one more thing about the grazing rights too. with the Bundy family. Very interesting that you have a family who came out there and for 120 years had the first in time, first in right, perfected water rights and grazing rights there. Those rights the government can't come in and just suddenly say, we're going to take those away now. That's not the way the law works. You cannot do that. Those are rights that have been passed down from generation to generation and are the strongest rights of any property right in the West. And this idea that they can just come in and take them away, I think ignores all that law too. And I forgot to mention that earlier.
And then they had a little First Amendment area that was sort of pinned in there where
Yeah.
you could practice your First Amendment. I'd like to get one of those in Florida because, we're a constitutional free zone down here because anywhere that's 100 miles from the border, the Constitution basically doesn't apply according to new DHS regulations. And so there's nowhere in the state of Florida that's more than 100 miles away from the border because we have the ocean all the way around us. So I'd like to get one of those down here, a little First Amendment area where we have one of our rights.
One of my favorite signs from everything that was down there was a little sign in front of that First Amendment area sign, and it said, the First Amendment is not an area. Up here in Washington State, we're familiar with the Constitution Free Zone. Part of Washington State falls under that. Since when are constitutional rights limited to a location? That's just incredible we're even having that discussion. And another reason, the federal government was wrong and violating the law. They were violating the law just by doing that. So we as Americans need to stand up to that. We need to educate our friends and neighbors about those things and take these stands and not back down, because one of the things they expect us to do is to not show up. They expect us to not show up or to go home and forget about it. We have got to stay ever vigilant if we want to remain free people.
And Thomas Jefferson's take on that was that government doesn't really give us those rights. It's God that gave us those rights, and they can't really be taken away from them. It's just government's job to more or less nurture those rights and make sure that they're protected. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. Again, the role of government is to protect our God-given unalienable rights to life, liberty, property, and the ability to defend the same. And that's not Matt Shea saying that. That was what John Hancock and his fellow patriots wrote as kind of a Boston Declaration of Independence. So, we as Americans have this wonderful gift, and the world looks to us for leadership on these issues. And here we have in our very own country something that you would think would happen over in Europe, where you have sniper rifles pointed at American citizens. And I do want to say something to the agents that were out there that did that. Most of them are probably veterans. We did not sign up as veterans to do that. We signed up as veterans to protect American citizens, not point rifles at them on American soil. That is just reprehensible. And I would hope that those folks that are agents and other law enforcement at the federal level would disobey orders to fire on American citizens who are protecting their constitutional rights. I hope they would do that. And I know Stuart Rhodes has made the same call to them, and I do too.
And do you think that people get that job and they're on the Bureau of Land Management and they really don't ever expect anything like that to happen, and then that day comes and they've never thought about what they're going to do when they get in that position, and then they're forced to make that decision, and they just kind of look around and their buddy's going along with the order and their other buddy's going along with the order, and so they just kind of cower into it because that's what all my buddies are doing and that's all I know to do?
Well, I think some of them actually look like they were probably hired. And I'll tell you why. I spent time, as I mentioned at the beginning of this show, over in Iraq, and these guys had full beards and they're wearing Oakley sunglasses and comporting themselves as if they had been in Afghanistan as special operations. And so I'm not saying they were. What I am saying is people that look like that and are acting like that on American soil is very disturbing. And you only do that if it's intentional, that you enjoy what you're doing. So I think some of those guys were intentionally hired to be a part of this. And I don't know necessarily if they really think or talk the way that we're talking right now about protecting and defending the Constitution.
Yeah, now that I think about it, the Mr. Ranger on the Yogi Bear cartoons, I never saw him with body armor or an AR-15.
Oh, yeah, or knee pads and and hatch gloves and Black Hawk vests or other types of kit vests. That was incredible to me to even see that. And again, loaded up for combat on American soil. I mean, that was the stuff that we wore overseas. I mean, it was the stuff we wore overseas. It's incredible to see that.
Now, you have sort of a unique view in the government that a lot of us don't get to see. How are things working inside the machine? Should we sit back and relax, or are we in good hands overall, or do we have cause for concern?
Well, I mean, clearly we have cause for concern. Everybody can see the economy's not headed in the right direction. Everybody can see that government, in particular at the national level, is not listening to the people. And very candidly, as a Republican, I refer to myself now more as just an American. Why aren't we being Americans who love the Constitution, who want to be self-reliant, God-fearing, freedom-loving people? And I see in Olympia a tendency not to go on the offense, a tendency to be reactionary. And so a couple of years ago, myself and 3 other legislators got together and we came up with what we called the Freedom Agenda. And they have their agenda for land use and everything else. Why not have an agenda for freedom? And so we put that forward, and lo and behold, we go on the offense. We build coalitions around issues, not parties, and we have everybody coming on board, and we have the most successful slate of conservative bills in over 2 decades, actually, with 65 bills that we introduced, including one to nullify what the NSA is doing in Washington State. Out of 65 bills, we had 42 hearings. Maybe normally in a year we get 2. We had 42 hearings, 32 passed out of the House or Senate, 12 signed into law without veto by our liberal governor, and we had 25 national news stories on top of that. Unfortunately, the constitutional use of drone bill was vetoed by our governor, but he put a moratorium on drone use in Washington State for 15 months. So we have made a massive and significant difference because we went on the offense, we articulated the principles of freedom, we abided by the principle that leadership is not the ability to compromise, but the ability not to, and look what's happening. So we're not in good hands, but there is cause for encouragement. If we show up together and unite, just like happened at the Bundy Ranch, just like happened with the Freedom Agenda, we win.
Now, have you considered running for U.S. Congress, or do you think that have you just pretty much given up on D.C. and you just think you can be more effective for your state?
Well,
state level?
We're making a lot of difference at the state level, and I'll actually relate a story. I was sitting in a closed-door room with Senator Jim DeMint, and Jim DeMint was probably about 5-6 feet away from me, and he just looked around the room and he said, the federal government, the federal level is lost. It's going to be up to you at the state and local level to restore a God-honoring constitutional republic. And I'm paraphrasing him, but his point was that we can have a massive difference at the state and local level. And so while I've been asked to run for Congress, I really believe that we need to defend freedom locally. And by doing that, by just standing at the local level, we can make a massive difference. And let me give you a specific example. With the Bundy Ranch scenario, if the county sheriff had stood up, none of this would have ever happened. If the county sheriff had just stood up and said, federal agents, you do not have permission to operate in this county, none of this would have ever happened. If the county commissioners had demanded coordination, which is the ability for county commissioners to, in a lot of ways, trump the federal government on environmental policy and regulation and land use issues, if they would have just done that and stood up, or even just put weight restrictions on the roads so the federal government couldn't move in armored vehicles or move cattle trucks, just something as simple as that, none of this would have ever happened with the Bundy family. It really goes back to something that's a fundamental principle of America, and that's government closest to the people is the best.
Now, we have a mutual friend who also works for the state of Washington, Glenn Tate. Glenn seems to think that not only do we have cause for concern, but he knows people within the government who are preparing for a cataclysmic event. Is that consistent with what you're hearing?
It is very consistent with what I'm hearing, and I have been talking about this since last summer when I made Rachel Maddow for advocating that people store up food and water, and apparently that was something very radical. But it was interesting when the TV folks interviewed me. They asked a question. They said, "Don't you think you're spreading a doctrine of fear?" And I said, What fear is there in being self-reliant? The folks up in North Idaho, I can't speak for them, but they weren't afraid of a darn thing. Self-reliance takes fear out of the situation. And it was interesting. They refused to play that on the nightly news, but after that, I didn't get any calls back for further follow-up interviews. So clearly people know that preparing for disasters is correct and right. And it doesn't necessarily even have to be this cataclysmic event. Although if we continue to print money and continue to do the things that we're doing at the federal level, and just completely eviscerate the manufacturing sector in America and do all of these things, yeah, the economy will crash. That is a mathematical certainty. But it's more than that. In Washington State, we had the Oso mudslide here 2 weeks ago. Entire communities cut off from the outside world, and their neighbors went and they helped neighbors. They went in and helped clear bodies out and helped clear the road and comforted people that had lost loved ones. That's what America is all about. And so it doesn't have to be some cataclysmic event. It could be just that mudslide that happens and is a horrible tragedy for a community. And if we're prepared for that eventuality, then we can actually love our neighbors. You can't, and it's very difficult anyway, to love your neighbor when government is doing it for you. We can actually make a difference just by being prepared for those situations and have a huge impact as Christians, and then have a huge impact toward freedom. And I think that one of the reasons the federal government wants to take people out of rural America and really has this war on rural America right now is to make people less self-reliant, because when they're less self-reliant, they're more dependent on government, and government can have more control. So clearly the antidote to what the government is doing right now is to be a God-fearing, self-reliant, freedom-loving American.
And we saw a lot of folks that were not prepared after Hurricane Sandy in New York. And that's what fear looks like. Those people were afraid. And these were well-to-do people that probably lived in Midtown Manhattan and probably pay $3,000 or $4,000 a month in rent, and I don't know what their incomes are, but they were digging through dumpsters.
Yeah, they were, and they had all the warnings. And again, this can happen anywhere. Hurricane Katrina, snowstorms in Washington State that shut down the freeways for a couple of days. Mount St. Helens going off. It can happen anywhere at any time. And so if you're prepared, that is actually showing love for your family and for your neighbor. And, I would just say one other thing as far as preparedness is concerned. A lot of people say it's some kind of bad word, some kind of fringe thing. Turn it back around on people. Ask them a question. Ask them, why are you not wanting to love your neighbor? Why are you not wanting to help other people out in a tragedy? Why are you really depending on government when we've seen government fail so many different times? Ask them questions, because that gets them thinking and bring them over to your point of view.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, FEMA and DHS had their 2014 capstone exercise in Alaska. A member of Oath Keepers released the specifics of the scenario where FEMA and DHS practiced for a 9.2 earthquake and tsunami. In the scenario, a group called Free Americans Against Socialist Tyranny launches a cyber attack against U.S. infrastructure. Now, I'd consider myself a free American. Well, maybe not free, but I'm an American. And I'd also probably say that I'm against socialist tyranny. Now, is everybody else that shares my political views planning some cyber attack that I don't know about?
Well, clearly there is an attempt to marginalize and demonize those people who are preparing. And it's curious that some of the rhetoric that's being used was used in Russia against the kulaki or the kulaks, the most productive members of society. So it's curious to see some of the exact same wording and phrasing being used in regards to the Patriot community. Very clearly, nobody in the Patriot community wants to damage the infrastructure of America, at least the true patriots want to damage the infrastructure of America or do anything. But clearly we all see the signs pointing in one direction, that if we continue down this road, the economy will collapse. We're making ourselves very vulnerable to cyber attack and EMP attack, and it's been talked about for years and years and years. So it's not some new revelation. It's just a matter of being prepared like our grandfathers and our grandmothers were. I mean, it was nothing, 20, 30 years ago to walk into my grandma's pantry and see it completely stocked. Now, she was a product of the Great Depression, but it was an American thing to have enough stored up in the good times to get you through the bad times. That was something we always did. So this isn't some fringe thing. And it's interesting that when people say it's fringe and you say, well, the government's preparing for it, and you kind of get this kind of weird look on their faces, and you follow it up and say, businesses, very large businesses have preparedness plans, right? And you get kind of a weird look from people. Well, if businesses and government are doing it, why aren't you? Or why is that fringe? So I think that's one of the ways we can kind of throw this back at people's laps and make them think about it.
And then is it also important for folks to be getting training with their firearms and things? I think we all hope that nothing like that ever happens, but does just the fact of being prepared decrease the chances for something like that to happen?
Well, yeah, I've been talking to people about 8 things that we all should be doing, and I can go through that. But to directly answer your question, absolutely, everybody should be trained, especially our wives and our mothers and our daughters should be trained, because there shouldn't be any victims of any crime or anything. That's the first part of the training. The second is the final check and balance in our system is a well-armed people, period. That's what the founders envisioned. The 8 things I tell people to do are very, very, very simply this. I tell them that the very first thing you need to do is to pray and repent. Very first thing. I mean, we cannot continue as Americans as an immoral, ungodly people and think that we're going to do well. The second thing is that we have to quit going to government for our needs. That means that we have to actually become entrepreneurs, and we have to help our friends and our neighbors out. The third thing is we have to do what we say we believe. That means we have to know what we believe. Have we read the Bible cover to cover? Have we read the Constitution cover to cover? Have we read the Declaration of Independence cover to cover? So we've got to know and do what we say we believe. And that means we have to be independent thinkers and voracious readers. And that, I think, is one of the key foundations of being an American. The fourth thing that we have to do is that we should owe no one anything. That means if we expect our government to be debt-free, then we should be debt-free also, and we should all work toward that. The fifth thing is very simply we need to prepare ourselves, and I call this the 4 S's. We need to learn how to shoot. That goes back to what we just talked about with training. We need to learn self-defense. That means hand-to-hand self-defense. The next thing that I think is equally important is that we need to learn how to operate in small groups of people to help people during a disaster, whether that's our family or whether that's our friends. And last but not least, the 4th S is that we have to, besides shooting, besides learning self-defense, besides learning how to operate in a small group, that we really have to all get in shape. And people say, well, are you're giving me an exercise pitch? And I'm saying, absolutely. You can't be out of shape trying to help your neighbor in a crisis. And we all should do that. And once we've prepared ourselves, then I think the next thing we have to do is prepare our families. And that means we stock up on food and we stock up on water, and we do have some extra ammunition in the house, because how are you going to defend your neighbor and how are you going to defend yourself and your family if you don't? It's just simple. And, as Thomas Jefferson said, learning how to shoot really engenders freedom in the mind. And I would have to agree with him, because it's the great equalizer, and allows good people to stop bad people. And once you've prepared your family, then the next thing is you prepare your community and your church. And, our church is ready for disaster. I mean, the very first call from a county sheriff should not be to FEMA in a disaster. It should be to the local churches to help with food distribution and clothing distribution and housing and everything else. That's how it should work. And in the Oso mudslide case up there, a lot of that is how it actually worked, where neighbors were the ones coordinating those things. And that's, I think, an American ideal. And then finally, once you've done all that, you need to become what some people call a tribal leader. I don't like that. It's more of a leader in your sphere of influence, and teach those people in your sphere of influence what I just talked about. So those are the 8 things I think we all should be doing, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. We shouldn't think it's a bad thing. If somebody says, I can't believe you're doing it, well, no, the question is, why aren't you doing it? And really turn it back on
that
them.
was a really, really good blueprint for preparedness and for what we need to be doing. I love the first thing, praying and repenting, because it doesn't really matter how well prepared you are. Statistically, 10 out of 10 people still die. And,
yeah.
and when that happens, you're going to meet your maker. And you need to be able to have an answer for him. What did you do with the blood of Christ? And, did you repent? And so you can be prepared for the zombie apocalypse and the economic crash and everything else. But if you're not prepared to meet your maker, then, everything else is pretty much in vain.
I totally agree with you. And it really should be an honor for all of us to be alive in this time. I mean, God put us here in this time for a reason, knowing what was going to happen. That should be very encouraging, because he knew that before the beginning of time. So we should also rest in that peace and look at this as an opportunity to preach the gospel, make disciples, and show our love to others. And what a great opportunity when people are crying and they're confused and they're hurt and they're starving, and you say, hey, I'm going to give you a bowl of beans, and I'm going to tell you about how Jesus did this for you. I mean, what an opportunity to be able to do that. And I don't want to be overly preachy, but the bottom line is that is so important, those relationships and showing that love, that it has to be mentioned.
Now, we've been having these ever increasing encroachments by government for some time now. Cliven Bundy, with having the snipers trained on women and children, is sort of the latest and worse abuse. But we've had our emails hacked. We've had Fox News was, I'm not a huge fan of Fox, but out of the big 3, maybe they're the cleanest dirty shirt, so to speak. But they had their newsroom hacked by the DOJ, and the IRS has targeted conservatives, and it's just been scandal after scandal after scandal, and it's just this ever encroaching abuse of government, and PRISM, the NSA spying and everything else. And now, when we think back to the Holocaust for the Jews, they weren't just free as a bird one day and the next day they're getting loaded into cattle cars. That was over a period of time that they were having these ever encroaching abuses placed on them, and they were sort of being conditioned into being slaves and being compliant. Now, did they do the right thing by complying with the German government in the 30s? And if not, when would have been a good time for the Jews to take a stand against the government, before or after they were loaded into the cattle cars?
Well, this is interesting, and actually goes back to something even earlier, and that's in Russia with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But I think Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Martin Niemöller, pastors, clearly said what the German government is not doing, and we have a duty to resist. And I want to talk specifically to Christians right now. there has been a complete misinterpretation of Romans 13, which, by the way, as I understand it from some people, was Hitler's favorite verse. It was also the favorite verse of pastors during the founding of our country. So what was different? Well, government that acted outside of the bounds that are laid out in Romans 13 to promote good and punish evil, when it was outside of those boundaries and actually became destructive, it was actually the duty of Christians to resist that. It was actually the duty of Christians to follow the higher law of God and not follow the contrary laws of government that were contrary to what is in the Word and what Jesus taught us. So the key here is that pastors have got to be teaching this to people. Otherwise, you will have what happened in the 1930s, potentially, in any country in the world. But it really goes back earlier to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's called the Solzhenitsyn question. And he was in the train cars headed to the Gulag, and he asked the famous question in his book, Gulag Archipelago, on pages 15 and 16. What point should we have resisted? Oh, how we burned in those cars later, thinking about at what point we should have resisted. And he answers the question this way: when they came to take our neighbor's stuff. That was the point at which he believed they should have resisted. And right now, what happened down in Nevada, they came to take our neighbor's stuff.
Wow, very, very good. Yeah, in Romans 13, Paul exhorts us to submit to the governing authorities. But now, there seems to be two different versions of governing authority. Would you classify the Constitution or Obama's executive order du jour as the legitimate authority that Paul's telling us that is instituted by God and that we're supposed to obey?
Well, the Constitution establishes the jurisdiction. The authority is vested in three separate branches of government, and one other branch that, actually two other branches that we never talk about, one being the people and the other being the states. There was supposed to be a vertical check and balance. So you had a check and balance internal to the federal government with the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branches. But you also had this vertical check and balance of the states, who were the agents, who were the principals that made the agent the federal government. So the principals still had a check in that system, but always there was the check by the people. So when we talk about legitimate authority, I mean, the legitimate authority is always God, but the Constitution provides these separate jurisdictions, and if people are acting outside the scope of their authority based on those jurisdictions, as President Obama has done over and over and over again, then that's not legitimate authority. He's acting outside, or in an ultra vires manner, as is said in the law, outside of the authorities that he's been given. So, and people are going to say, well, Matt, who are you to determine that, something is wrong or unconstitutional or outside the scope of authority? And I just simply reply, why do we take an oath of office? Why is that in the U.S. Constitution for us as state legislators to take an oath of office? And people kind of look at me weird, and I say, because all of us are supposed to be making those determinations that are in elected office. But I think even better, all of us are supposed to be making those determinations as Americans. And people say, well, this issue of state sovereignty was settled with the Civil War. And I say, well, aside from the fact that legal issues are not settled by war, this was not settled by the Civil War. It was actually settled at Nuremberg. That Befehl ist Befehl, an order is an order, was not an excuse to do the wrong thing. So you couldn't just blindly follow a government order, whether you were a soldier or whether you were a civilian. You couldn't just blindly follow a government order. It was up to every single citizen to determine what was right and what was wrong, and to act in accordance with what God had intended for those moments and situations. And this whole issue of, should the Supreme Court be the final arbiter of what is or what is not constitutional, was settled at Nuremberg. And people, I think, everywhere need to understand that and need to follow it. Because as Americans, to be self-reliant, freedom-loving, God-fearing people, we have to. Otherwise, we're no better than all these civilizations that have collapsed and gone that other route, which has led to the deaths of many, many, many people.
Now, what about the 2012 NDAA indefinite detention clause? Are you concerned that that could ever be used against American citizens?
Absolutely. In fact, we introduced a bill. Part of our freedom agenda was actually to nullify that inside Washington State. And I say nullify, but it actually was to instruct all state-level employees, all agents of the state, anyone that's contracted with the state of Washington to not be involved in the indefinite detention of any American citizen. So we were really trying to, cut it off at the jurisdictional level. And absolutely, absolutely I'm concerned, because how are we even talking about American citizens being locked up in a prison indefinitely without any habeas corpus, without any sort of right to counsel, without all of these things that at the founding of this country were the reasons that we broke away from Great Britain. It's just incredible we even have to have that discussion, but we apparently do here in America today, because it's happening all over. And for your listeners, it was called the Preservation of Liberty Act, House Bill 1581.
Now, you mentioned that if we don't change what we're doing financially in Washington, that an economic collapse is a mathematical certainty. Can you expound on that a little bit? What worries you about the economy?
Well, all right. Well, there's three main things. So let's just start with the fact that the Federal Reserve is printing, and I know people are going to say, well, they don't actually print money. Yes, they do. They do it electronically, but they're creating money to the point and to the tune of $75 billion a month. And I know they've drawn it back a little bit now, but that cannot possibly be sustained. And the second thing that's a problem is the federal debt and owing this debt to foreign countries, but more particularly that we have so much of it. I mean, I've heard $100 trillion in liabilities, unfunded liabilities that are out there. I mean, that just the math alone, there isn't enough GDP in America to make up for that. And it's not just the federal level. I mean, at Washington state level, we've got between $48 and $60 billion of debt. Our current state budget's about $30 billion. How do we pay for that? There's no way to pay for it. So it's not just the unfunded liabilities and the debt at the federal level. It's also the unfunded liabilities and debt at the local level. The last thing that I would say is we've completely eviscerated the manufacturing sector of America, and we've outsourced it to places like China. Now, China, it was just reported yesterday, has the slowest growth in 24 years. Well, I could have told you that a month and a half ago when their iron ore prices crashed on March 10th. That means that the Chinese manufacturing sector is going to have a significant downturn. Are we ready to pick that up in America and retool our manufacturing sector? It doesn't sound like we are. And if we continue to not create true wealth, which comes only out of the ground or the air or the water, then we can't get out of this. Mathematically, we're not producing any wealth. We're borrowing everything. There is no way to get out of that. And I think the answer is very simply to get rid and abolish the Federal Reserve, repeal the 16th Amendment, which instituted the income tax and allowed people to be taxed personally instead of the taxes flowing through the states, which was originally the intent, so there could be a monetary check against the federal government if it got out of control. And then lastly, repeal the 17th Amendment, which was making the direct election of U.S. senators the rule now. One of the issues was the check of states on the federal government, and they did that not only through the tax structure, but also through having those senators selected by the state legislators, so they would go over there and they could be a check when needed against federal government encroachment on the states. So that has to be returned if we want to see that balance returned. And I think that the last thing is, and we've introduced a bill here in Washington State to recognize gold and silver as legal tender in Washington State in conjunction and in accordance with the Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution, is we have to return to that gold and silver standard. I think that I would add one more to that, and that would be a gold, silver, and commodities-based standard. because it would be based on Adam Smith's real bill theory, where commodities can actually have value, and we have the technology today to track that as commodities are created and stored in inventory and warehouses. I think you could actually base a currency system on that. Technologically, we have the ability for that to happen today. So that would be my solution, and I think something that needs to happen here in America.
And commodities were recognized as a store of value along with gold and silver. If we go all the way back to Genesis 13:2, it says Abraham was rich in cattle and gold and silver. So, I mean, it sort of bunches commodities right there with gold and silver.
It's interesting you say that too, because as I think about it, this whole controversy with the Bundy Ranch, and the Lord is the owner of the cattle on 1,000 hills, not the government.
But I think the government would like to be Lord sometimes.
Well, clearly they're trying to put themselves in that place.
They've said in their heart that they will ascend above the mountain of God.
Yes.
Now, folks can catch you on Radio Free Readout from time to time. You do the Way I See It segment. Now, you also do your own podcast called Battlefront. Now, where can folks find that?
Battlefront they can find on Podbean, Matt Shea on Podbean, but I also broadcast live on the American Christian Network 106.5 FM in Spokane every every Tuesday at 8:30, and also at 12:30 on the AM stations. You can go to my website, my email is matt@voteshea.com. And my website is voteshea.com. You can go to my website and actually check out where you live in Eastern Washington and what station that American Christian Network is playing on. So I really try to reach out to people. And, again, send me an email if you have any questions about that or how you can get a hold of me. We also stream live on the Internet through ACN as well.
Well, Representative Shea, thank you so much for coming on the show, and thanks again so much for providing leadership for the Patriot movement. I just think that is so absolutely important, and you're doing God's work.
Well, thank you, Mark, for everything you're doing, and love to have you on my radio show sometime, and maybe we can be back on again talking about these issues.
Hey, Preppers and Patriots. American Meltdown, the long-awaited sequel to American Exit Strategy, is now available in Kindle and paperback. In American Meltdown, Book 2 of the Economic Collapse Chronicles, the new president, Anthony Howe, signs an executive order banning all semi-automatic weapons. Matt, Adam, and Wesley Baer begin training with their local militia for the battle that is coming. Within weeks of the inauguration, the $700 trillion derivatives bubble pops when rates on U.S. debt skyrocket. The derivatives crisis is the final nail in the coffin of the banking system and the death of the fiat currency system in America. With the dollar gone, commerce comes to a screeching halt. While times prove to be tough for all, survival favors the prepared. Get your Kindle or paperback copy of American Meltdown, Book 2 of the Economic Collapse Chronicles on Amazon